Shalom everyone, and welcome to this online Bible course on the first 5 books of the Bible. I am Father Randy Flores, SVD, the Biblical Apostolate Director for the Diocese of Cubao in Quezon City, and also the Parish Priest of the Sacred Heart Parish Shrine in this city. If you want to follow this course and be notified when there are updates, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can do it now. Thank you.
Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Be'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, Bekol lebaveka, o bekol nafsheka, o bekol meodeka. Vehayu hadebarim ha'ele, asher mesabeka hayom al lebaveka. Veshinantam lebanecha, bedibar tabam, beshibtecha, bebeteka, o blekteka baderek, o bshok beka, o bekomeka. Ukshartam leot al yadecha, behayu letutapot ben enecha, o tabtam al mezuzot beteka, o bish areka, sela. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Take to heart these words, which I enjoin on you today. Drill them into your children. Speak of them at home and abroad, whether you are busy or at rest. Bind them at your wrist as a sign, and let them be as a pendant on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your houses and on your gates. Our topic for session number 3 is on the book of Exodus, the so-called second book of Moses, or the second book of the Bible. First, there are 2 or 3 titles of this book. I already mentioned one, the second book of Moses. Well, understandably, when you read the book of Exodus, it's really about Moses, beginning from his miraculous birth to his constructing the so-called tabernacle as specified by God at the foot of Mount Sinai. So, another title, of course, this is more common, is Exodus. Ek in Greek is out. Hodos is odometer, means the way, something like a way out, referring, of course, the departure of the Israelites out of Egypt. So, Exodus, that's the Greek name. However, the Hebrew name is Ele Hashemot. You have the word Shem there. Shem. That is the word for name, because in the book of Exodus, it begins, if you notice, with a list of names of Jacob's children who came down to Egypt. And that's in verses 1 to 5. That's for this reason, the book is called in Hebrew, that's the name in Hebrew, Ele Hashemot. These are the names, and these are the names. So, if you have the Hebrew Bible, it's not called Exodus here. It's called These Are the Names, taken from the first line, first major phrase of the book. What is the connection between Genesis and Exodus? If you're watching a series, for example, you want always the first season somehow be connected with, there is a story, no? Kaya nga hindi niyo natatapos eh. Hindi kayo napapagod manood doon kasi tuloy-tuloy lang siya. May mga connection siya kasi doon sa unang season pa na hindi mo mabasa. Pag hindi mo napanood yung first season, you have no idea what is happening doon sa second season. The one that would connect them together would be two themes. The first, the one that connected also all the different parts of the book of Genesis, the first book, is the fact that they are fulfilling what God promised them. That is to be many, starting from Genesis chapter 2 to the time of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, the promise to be many, to multiply. And that you will find also in the book of Exodus, specifically in chapter 1, verse 7. And it says that Joseph's death And that generation first is mentioned in verse 6, as well as the fact that the Israelites in Egypt, if I may quote now, multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. And in fact, this would threaten the Pharaoh. That's one. Another theme, and which I would like to pursue dito sa Bible study natin, the theme na who is really in charge. No. It's not Moses, it's not the Pharaoh. It's God. And let me say this in the phrase, in the word sovereignty, using, of course, the language of monarch. We can use soberania in Tagalog. That God is the one who rules, who takes charge, who is sovereign. So that would be the theme that would not only connect the book of Genesis to Exodus, but even the whole book of Exodus will be absorbed, it will be present in the different parts of Exodus. If I may to recall again yung ending ng Genesis, Jacob's children being settled in Egypt, and then comes the death of the patriarch Joseph. Ends there. Then the Israelites started to become many. The divine promise to be many is thus being fulfilled, even if there is one element that they do not have, the land. Their big number, yung pagkadami nila, threatened Pharaoh. And when the Israelites escaped from Egypt, they will also to travel to that land promised to them. The Lord who established His sovereignty at creation. Paano nyo makita na the Lord establishes His sovereignty sa creation? Well, by establishing Sabbath. Why Sabbath? Number of stories in the ancient world. What is the sign that the God or gods are in charge or have a ruling over all people, over all the universe, over all creation? Usually, they establish their house on earth. The gods live in the faraway mountains, like Mount Olympus, but when they take part in the affairs of the human beings, what do? First, they established a house. They established their palace. They established their temple. So the temple, therefore, is the visible sign that the Lord is sovereign over all the earth, over all creation. But where do you find that in the book of Genesis? Wala namang itinayo na palasyo, wala namang itinayo na templo, o kahit tolda lamang, wala namang tinayo. Meron. The Sabbath. That is the house of God, not in space, but in time. So, hindi man siya nakapagtayo ng tahanan niya sa lupa, in space, pero ang Diyos is not bound by space and time. So He can also establish a house in time. And that house in time is the Sabbath. So you see, that theme of sovereignty, creation, is clear. And then the Lord guides the ancestors. He is showing His sovereignty. And it is the same Lord who will confirm this sovereignty over Pharaoh in Exodus. And that we will see later on. What we can say would connect the two dots. Kung series man pinapanood niyo, yung dalawang seasons, merong common tema. Well, we all know how important the book of Exodus is to the Jews, first and foremost. It is their foundational text, something like a constitution, especially that event, the crossing of the sea. So, foundation. But not only the Jews, also the Christians. We, Christians, it is our foundational text. We have the word Pesach or Passover, where we have Pasqua later on. And we recall this during Holy Week. We recall the Passover of Jesus, the Passover meal, and also using the template of Passover for His passion, death, and resurrection. So without the book of Exodus, it's difficult to explain, especially the mystery of our redemption. So foundational text. The structure of the book, go to commentaries. Marami silang suggestions, but I always go to the most common one para hindi nakakalito. Kasi if I give you the more complicated ones, as others scholars suggest, it might be confuse us right away. So it's better to get the simple one. And the simple one is this. There are two parts of the book of Exodus based on its geographical away from Egypt. The first part is the first 18 chapters, which is Egypt, and then just out of Egypt. And then the more dramatic one, or the more intense one, is 19 to 40. And this is the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai. As I already told you before, this part would take the narrators a lot of time to narrate this event. In fact, it's not finished in the book of Exodus. It's still in the Leviticus and in the first part of the book of Numbers. Tuloy-tuloy yun, yung event sa Sinai. Well, those who have been to Mount Sinai, they're happy at least to be able to step on the place where that thing happened. Archaeologists have identified two Mount Sinai actually. And the more popular one is the one doon sa pinupuntahan ng mga turista ngayon. But anyway, as I said, this is the second part of the book of Exodus, when they are the revelation of the Torah, of the law at Mount Sinai. So two parts. Part one, let me just elaborate a bit. Still common to us, the stories there are not unfamiliar to us. Usually this part is the subject matter of many movies, like the movies Ten Commandments or Prince of Egypt. They take this, especially the climax, which is the crossing of the sea. Jacob, children, Israel in Egypt, in chapter 1, and then the young Moses, the birth of Moses, and his being a fugitive. No? Chapter 2 to chapter 4 there. In chapter 2, chapter 3, you have his calling by God for a mission, and then he goes to Pharaoh, and then you have chapter 5 to 11, the series of plagues, Salot, the celebration of the Passover just before they escape, and then the Exodus from Egypt, especially chapter 14, where you have the narrative of the crossing of the sea, and then begins their wilderness journey. That ends the first part when they get just out of Egypt. We don't have a lot of time really to discuss one by one, but later on, if we finish everything, I've finished the 5 books, I will go back to some major texts or passages to dwell on, to discuss. So, but it's good to, as a kind of entry to this text, to read them yourself. Maganda kasi nga binabasa ninyo. Ako, binasa ko uli para dito sa ating klase. Although I have read a number of times yung Exodus, binasa ko uli kanina, starting kahapon, para lang ma-refresh. Part 2 of Exodus 19 to 40, revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So, the first part would be, once they're out of Egypt, they're no longer slave, they receive a new status. If you are a slave, you have no status. You are not a nation even, because you have no freedom. So, once they're out of Egypt, they gain a new status. And beautifully described by the writer. First, he said, a treasured possession, kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. Imagine those 3 terms of endearment, no? The way the Lord looks at Israel. He's a segula. Segula is one word, but what is a treasured possession? A kingdom of priests. What do you mean kingdom of priests? Priest ruling the kingdom? Maybe it's not like that the priest becomes the king, and he rules like theocracy. What does the priest do? Well, they offer sacrifice. Their mission is to make the people holy. So it's something to do with Israel being close to God because of their offerings and their sacrifices. And obviously, connected with that is to become a holy nation. It involves two things, loving God and loving your neighbor. Then, letter B, uh, the second part would be the building of a house. I told you how important that God has a house here on earth. Why? Because that is the sign that He is sovereign. He establishes His house on earth. That's part of the dynamics of gods and goddesses in the ancient world. To show that they are in charge of the universe, they must have a house. And we said, the Sabbath, dun sa creation story, is God's house in time. Now, He needs a house in space. And so, you will have a long narrative. In fact, taking up 1/3 of that, of the book of Exodus, instructing Moses to build a house for God. And that is the chapter 24 to 31, interrupted by big crisis, not pandemic. The Israelites, after all what God has told them about being treasured possession, kingdom of priests, and holy nation, they worship other gods. And they created their own God. The incident, the golden. And the basic question then is, since Israel abandoned God, will the Lord remain? Then, the last part would be the building of God's house. So, that's God's planning to build a house. And then, the execution of that house, back again to that narrative about the building of the house for God, or sometimes it's called the tent of meeting in chapters 35 to 40. So, that's the second part of the book of Exodus, which is not so familiar with many. Because as I told you, karamihan sa atin, familiar dun sa 1 to 18 kasi nga material yun ng movie. Magandang gawan ng Sinai yun kasi yung crossing of the sea, yung Pharaoh na ayaw sumunod doon kay Moses, obstinate, matigas ang kanyang puso, nagpabago-bago ang kanyang isip. So, ang gandang gawan yun ng movie. But, as I said, it seems that the emphasis of the narrator is a revelation of the Torah, Mount Sinai. So he stops his speed of narrating there by spending a lot of time describing in detail even, detalyado, yung paano gagawin yung house of God. So you see the emphasis then of the... So let's now take the second part, and I'm going to zero in on particular theme. I was telling a while ago na yung book of Exodus, pag tatahiin mo yan, pag put them together, the different episodes, different stories, narratives, including even the laws, kasi may mga batas dito, the commandments in particular, what can bind them together? So, lagi nating iniisip, kasi we want to show that the Word of God is not compartmentalized. Yung kasi maraming tayong tendency ngayon, kinaka-compartmentalize yung Word of God. Huhugutin mo lang yung huhugutin mo yung, parang hugot lines ang ginagawa mo sa Biblia. Huhugutin mo yung passage, then ipopost mo. That's also okay. Inspiring naman yun, no? Pero, on a more serious manner and with respect sa original intention ng author, the verb of number 11, it's always good to see yung how this literature, this one piece of work called Exodus, authored by, we do not know, but definitely inspired by God, ito yung tema niya. And lahat ng nangyayari sa Exodus, nandoon yung tema na ito. And there are a number of suggestions for the book of Exodus, but one that I think positively presented is the theme of the Lord's sovereignty over Israel. Nabanggit ko na kanina ito noong sa book of Genesis, yung na ang Diyos ang in charge of everything that happens, good or bad, shows He manifests who He is. His sovereignty over creation, over Israel. And it runs throughout, this theme runs throughout the book of Exodus. So, example would be the plague narrative, which you find in chapter 7 to 11. Bakit? Anong ibig sabihin niya ng hardening of Pharaoh? Mapapansin nyo, yung expression na but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Yung bang sasabihin ng Panginoon, punta ka kay Pharaoh, gagawin mo ito, gawin mong staff na ito, o kaya may mangyayari na plague, no? Yung frogs, yung ilog turn into blood. So all these so-called natural phenomenon, natural disasters being interpreted as action on the part of God. And then the Pharaoh would be sasabihin niya, okay, no? Okay. But then after some time, ayaw na naman niya palayain ang Israelita. Why? Because the Lord hardened the Pharaoh's heart. Ano naman ito? Bakit cyclic? Bakit gusto niya ngang palayain? Bakit naman pinapatigas niya ang puso ng Pharaoh? Could you imagine the irony of that? No? Sasabihin ng Diyos kay Moses, puntahan mo yung Pharaoh, let my people go. Payag yung Pharaoh, but then, ang gagawin ng God, He will harden the heart of Pharaoh. Hindi naman siya papayag. What's the point of that? What's the point of the narrator by doing that? As I said, if you go back to the theme, who is really in charge? Pharaoh is not in charge. It's God who is in control of everything. And that will be the theme that you will find even in the prophets. And you notice there, na yung mga supposed to be enemies of Israel, controlled by God. Kumbaga, yung kanilang action ay form for Israel to repent, to go back to God. So, siya ang may hawak ng lahat na nangyayari. And this theological discussion, especially when we enter in sa topic na can God not control evil things in the world? Yun yung tanong natin ngayon. Pandemic. Yung Diyos ba, hindi niya kayang, ba't hindi niya pinapatigil yung pandemya na ito na nagkawindang-windang na tayo and many people are dying, innocent people, good doctors. Sayang na sayang. Why people, yung mga those who have no means are the one ang unang tinatamaan ngayon. Why would God not stop this? And we know that He's in charge. That's how we understand. Why does He allow? He might not create evil, kasi that is against His nature, God being good. Pero He can allow evil to happen. Hindi niya ginawa ang evil kasi against the nature of God to create what is evil because He is good, absolute good, but He can allow evil to happen because of His power. But why does He allow evil to happen? It's a question that we might be able to find answers. Maybe when we up there face to face with God, we can ask God why. But as long as we live, I think it remains that way, a mystery. But the point is, here, it's God who is in control. Then, also, the crossing of the sea. No? Towards the end, what's the purpose for the crossing of the sea? Well, to liberate them out of Egypt, to worship God in freedom. However, is also to that they would know that I am the Lord, that I am Yahweh. Is a kind of a recognition formula paulit-ulit so that the Pharaoh or so that the Egyptians, so that you may know kung na ako ang Panginoon. Meaning, I am in charge. So, and then, these are quotations of yung recognition formula, yung expression na, know that I am the Lord. Sa mga passages na ito. Okay. Now, the last verse, after they cross the sea, chapter 14, chapter 15, you have a hymn. And they say, the Exodus chapter 15, the song of Moses and Miriam after the crossing of the sea, song of victory, is one of the, if not the oldest text in the Bible in terms of the Hebrew style. Yung pinakalumang written the text is a poetry kasi may nag-doctorate, may mga nag-aral about the language and the style of the poetry, and they assert that itong chapter 15 na ito is one of the oldest, if not the oldest text sa Hebrew Bible. And in that sense, the whole of the Bible. And the last verse of that, Song of Moses and Miriam, ano uli yung ina-assert doon? That Yahweh will reign forever and ever. So, the emphasis that who is in charge, not Pharaoh is God. No? It's the Lord who will reign forever and ever. And then you have the transition in chapter 15, verse 22 to chapter 18, verse 27. They are now out of Egypt, going to Mount Sinai, and they have encountered a series of problems. Water is a problem, food is a problem, enemies is a problem, but nalalampasan lagi nila yon. The Lord is always making an intervention. Bakit? Well, once again, to show who is in charge, to show that He is the sovereign of Israel. Now they reach sa Sinai. Exodus chapter 19, the first part is 19, verse 1 to 24, verse 11. This part, nasa Sinai na sila, one of the most intense moments in the book of Exodus. Kumbaga, you can call it like a climax. Pwedeng climax yung crossing of the sea, pero hindi pa tapos yung story. Kauumpisa pa lang . Yung crossing of the sea, chapter 14. Yung ending ng Exodus, chapter 40. So you would see that hindi pa yun yung climax, hindi pa yung matatapos. And it seems the climax is this part, the receiving of the law. And in chapter 20, what do you have there? Well, the Ten Commandments. Now, in this part, those who are studying the Hebrew text, they immediately notice the high prose in style. Ibig sabihin, napakagaling yung sumulat nito. So, they even say maybe he is not the same writer na encounter natin sa Exodus chapter 1 to 18. Pero pagdating mo dito sa chapter 19, mag-iiba yung style, yung prose. Mukhang iba na yung sumulat, no? Kasi exceptional yung prose niya, parang poetry, almost like a poetry. You would not, of course, notice that pag English translation ang binabasa ninyo. And what is the center here is the berit, meaning the covenant, the making of the covenant. Let me read to you the first part of that, which is chapter 19, 4 to 6. Chapter 19. And kung may time kayo, paulit-ulit yung basahin ito. It's a amazing description, no, of Israel in relation to God. And you can even adapt it as your own. No? 19:4 to 6. This is the beginning of that narrative. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings. Wow! How I bore you on eagle's wings. God using a metaphor here, no? Parang mga sisiw, basang sisiw ang Israel. God, like a mother hen, like a eagle, no? Carrying yung mga basang sisiw on its wings. No? What a beautiful metaphor. And brought you to myself. Verse 5. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my berit covenant, you shall be my, sinabi ko na kanina, treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So, three things there. God and Israel, now a free people. Malaya na sila. They are out of slavery. Anong relasyon nila ngayon sa Diyos? It's God who took the initiative to call them to be His own people. Siya yung unang nagkusa para makipag-covenant para yung Israel ay kanyang his own. So divine initiative. Pinili sila ng Diyos, in short. And what is the response to that is obedience. And obedience is to be rewarded. Disobedience means death. That's the relationship defined by a covenant. What is Israel's response? Handa kami. We will do twice. No? The beginning of the narrative and at the end of the narrative. Check yung 19:7-8 and 24 verse 3 and verse 7. Anong sabi ng Israel? Handang-handa kami. We shall do. Kaya, and the center of that narrative is the first part, what we call the first part or the first commandment. In the chapter 20, once we enter chapter 20, you know how the 10 commandments there, chapter 20, verses 2 to 3. Let us read that part because that is the center. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And then, followed by the so-called Decalogue or the 10 commandments. The freedom that they receive from God, okay? the freedom that they receive from God, what is the consequence of that is defined in the first commandment. Meaning, you shall have no other gods before me. Yahweh alone has freed Israel, hence, Yahweh alone has rights over Israel. So, sovereign. He is the sovereign of Israel and not other sovereigns or not other gods. Oh, I explained a while ago this one, the Israel's new status. If you review what I said a while ago, let me just repeat the Hebrew expressions there. So, exclusive possession or treasured possession. The Hebrew word is segula. Priestly kingdom. The Hebrew word is mamleket kohanim. Holy nation, goy kadosh. Mamleket is kingdom. Kohanim is priest. Nation is goy. Kadosh is holy. And then, this new relationship is sealed with a sprinkling with blood. Why blood? Well, blood symbolizes life. And where does life come from? It comes from God. Covenant, the sealing of the covenant later on, would like circumcision, is the shedding of blood. When you reach chapter 21, verse 1, after the Decalogue, or after the 10 commandments, or 10 words. Sometimes it's called 10 commandments, but the word commandments is not used in the Hebrew. The word there is word, 10 words, devarim. The other laws that come afterwards, chapter 21 up to chapter 22, mahahaba yun, would be what they call the case laws, the so-called mishpatim, meaning those are the laws that would put into concrete yung 10 commandments. Thou shalt not kill. In what sense shall we not kill? So, those are the apodictic laws ang tawag nila doon. Okay, mga prohibitions in generic terms, apodictic laws. But you need the case laws. If you read those case laws dito, some of them are really obsolete. No? And they are not supposed to be ideal laws. No? They are the laws at the time. For example, laws sa mga slavery, tungkol sa pagnanakaw, may tungkol sa cursing your father and mother, no? Tungkol sa property, pagbabayad ng utang, restitution. They reflect yung daily life ng Israel and the problems that they encounter. And pag binabasa mo, ang dami namang batas. Di ba? Naiinis ka. If you go to the ancient world and you see that even before these laws in the Bible, there are 2,000 years before the time of Christ na mga batas. There even are code. Meaning, pag-code kasi more systematic na yung pagpresent ng batas. You have the so-called Hammurabi Code. No? This is 2,000 years before the time of Christ. No? The Hammurabi Code. No? code of the king. And they are laws or statutes or ordinances are a sign of a civilized world, of a world of a nation that has an organization. Eh kung law of the jungle lang yung sinusunod ng tao, chaos. And that is a sign of a less advanced society. A more advanced society, they have law. And so do not piss off, sorry for the word, pag nakikita nyo lang, ano yung mga batas dito sa book of Exodus? They are there, but yes, they might be obsolete now, and they are not ethical and ideal laws that we should follow today. See, some of them are really obsolete, and they do not are not applicable to our present condition, but they indicate how advanced the society at the time. Meron silang ganitong mga statutes and ordinances. It is the sign of organization. And why can they organize themselves like this? Well, it's because the symbol of the Lord as sovereign. They remember, there are no kings here. Moses is the only leader. So they can organize because they look up to a sovereign, the one who is in control, the one who is in charge, and that is God. So it goes back to the theme. Now, when we move to chapter 24, verse 12, 31, verse 18. So, after the series of casuistic law, now, isi-zero in on ng writer, at sinabi ko kanina, mahaba itong salaysay niya tungkol sa pagtatayo ng bahay ng Diyos, o what we call the tabernacle. Huwag niyong isipin yung tabernakulo natin dito sa simbahan. Same word, but different sense. The word in Hebrew is mishkan, or the hamishkan, the tabernacle, the house of God, the sanctuary. After the revelation of the Lord, of the Torah, the heart of the Torah is the commandment, the Decalogue, and then later on, the series of case laws. After the revelation, now the revelation of a plan, the tabnit in Hebrew, an architectural plan to construct a house for God, a tabernacle in the desert, or the Mishkan. And that would take chapters 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. Ang haba, almost one-third of the book of Exodus, including its construction. So after yung plan, detailed plan na ang hirap i-translate ngayon into modern languages, kasi wala na tayong idea kung ano yung mga measurements na sinasabi doon. Detailed. Parang isipin mo pa, itong atang nagsulat ay marunong sa architecture. Bakit detalyadong sinasabi niya kung paano gagawin yung tabernacle, yung tent of meeting, o yung sanctuary, o yung house for God. The Hebrew word is mishkan. And then, babalikan niya yung construction ng bahay ng Diyos in chapters 35 to 40. So that all in all, one-third of the book of Exodus ay tungkol sa construction of the tabernacle, or the house for God, or the Hamishkan. What's the point of that? Again, what is the significance of God having a house here on earth? Of course, that He is in charge of everything here on earth. And His presence is affirmed here on earth. Bakit? Yung Diyos ba ay kahit nasa langit, wala siya sa lupa? That is our modern understanding. Wala naman silang understanding that God is omnipresent. A modern philosophical understanding ng God yun, na ang Diyos ay omnipresent. The ancient way of understanding God is, God has a house in Teman. God has a house doon sa mountain. Nandoon siya. Paminsan-minsan siya dumadalaw. But for the God of Israel, no. He is the same God with the ancestors, accompanied them in Egypt, now in the desert, and He is telling them that I shall be with you forever by establishing my house here on earth, and thus commands Moses to build the Mishkan. And if you have some kind of a illustration of that from the text of the book of Exodus, you have something like this. North there is going north. This one is north. And that's the entrance. You have the altar there where animals are offered, and the courtyard here. Okay, so this part is reserved for for the people in general. But then once you enter the second layer here, the priest, no, who can enter here, okay, to prepare for the table for bread, to light the incense, and only Moses can enter Holy of Holies, the pinakbanal na lugar ng something like yung hierarchy din noong Mount Sinai. Doon sa baba ng Mount Sinai, sa foot ng Mount Sinai, yung mga tao. May sa bandang gitna, pag akit mo ng konti, yun yung mga pari. And then face-to-face, communing with God is Moses. So, may tatlong layer yung, hindi naman protocol ito, pero yung interaction with God. And then, yung pinaka-sacred item in the tabernacle is the aron or the ark. What is the content of the ark? The content of the ark is the commandments. Maybe the covenant. But it says the Decalogue, the commandments. That's in chapter 25. And na may dalawang cherubim na nasa tuktok niya. The image of a cherubim. Speaking of, thou shall not make graven images. May cherubim silang ginawa. But that's another, maybe something like that, no? This is an artist, modern artist portrait, no? I don't think kamukhang tao yung mga cherubim. Maybe they were thinking of those winged creatures guarding the palaces of the kings and in the ancient world, like in Mesopotamia. Usong-uso yung mga, parang sa Chinese minsan, pagpasok mo sa mga temple, may leon na nakaharang doon. Parang ganon. Pagpasok mo sa mga temple nila, may dalawang mukha niya, tao, doon sa baba niya ay hayop. So, winged creature ang tawag dyan. They know that because they have found that in some archaeological explorations. So, what's the point of all that? Again, is the visible sign. They are the visible signs of God's presence and His presence, sovereign presence here on earth. And we move to Exodus chapter 32 to 34, the great cry. After all this initiative of God and telling Israel na sila ay segula, treasured possession, mamleket kohanim, kingdom of priests, and goy kados, a holy nation, while Moses was out and communing with God, they created a God for themselves. And that's the incident of the golden calf. Another God. You remember what God said? Thou shalt not have other gods before me. Exactly the opposite ang ginawa nila, the golden calf. And the consequences are catastrophic and symbolized by Moses breaking yung tablets of stone containing the commandments na sinulat mismo ng Diyos sa kanyang kamay, written with the finger of God. What's the symbolism of that? Meaning, the covenant is over. Tapos na. Tapos na. Tapos na yung pagiging Diyos ni God sa mga Israel. Tapos na yung relasyon. That's the end of the line. Tapos na. The covenant, tapos na. Symbolized by the broken tablets of stone. So, the question is, then will be, will the Lord continue to live amid His people na tapos na? The great crisis. Well, thanks to Moses. Moses intercedes. He begs God. And you have a beautiful exchange between God and Moses in chapter 33, verse 14. Maybe we can have a sample reading that. Moses asking God to change his mind. We are asking God now to change His mind dito sa pandemic na inalaw niya sa atin. Chapter 33, verse 14. He said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And he said to him, if your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found here favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? In this way, we shall be distinct, I and your people, from every people on the face of the earth. Kino-convince ni Moses God. And then verse 17, the Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked. For you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. It's because of Moses that the Lord changed his mind, meaning he will remain with Israel in the midst of his people. Thus, they would have the renewal of the covenant in chapter 34. And from this moment on, God who accompanies Israel will be a God of forgiveness and mercy. You see how God is so consistent in his being forgiving. Hindi siya yung nagtatantrams. Exodus chapter 35:40. We are now reaching the end of the book of Exodus. Now, after the explanation of the detail of the plan to construct the house for God, the building of the tabernacle in which Yahweh will take up residence, put up, and the Lord now has shown that He is the only real sovereign of Israel. How is that? Because His presence is described as like a cloud on top of the tent of meeting and with the so-called glory of the Lord, or in Hebrew, Kavod Adonai. Let me read that last part, chapter 40, beginning with verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting means the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And the glory of the Lord, that's the Kavod Adonai, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, they will not set out until the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey, meaning they are being accompanied by God. Since the Lord now lives in the midst of His people and is sovereign, so nandyan na si Lord, promised not to abandon them, He is the sovereign Lord, it is now necessary to organize the people in relation to the divine presence. It is now important to have a kind of organization. Kung nandyan yung boss, mag-organize ka. The Lord is with us. And so we should behave, do something, organize ourselves so that we can commune with God all the time, and the Lord, His presence is affirmed. So how do you do that? How do you organize yourself in view of the presence of the Lord in your midst? Symbolized, of course, by the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the Aron, the ark, the tent of meeting, the cloud, and the fire during the night, and the Kavod Adonai, the glory of the Lord. Well, that will be the task of the book of Leviticus, the third book of the Bible. Ito po si Father Randy Flores, Secretary at Parish Shrine, Quezon City, Director ng Biblical Apostolate ng Diocese of Cubao. Magandang gabi po sa kanilang lahat. Good night. Bye-bye.